Hello, nice to be with you. This paper aims to show how use of archival resources can inform and enrich our understanding of the place of theatre and entertainment culture. Historic theatre buildings are important in the history of theatre and entertainments, architecturally and socially. They make important statements and serve as city landmarks and meeting places, often as the focus of significant continuities. Indeed, a big part of the continued popularity of, for instance, pantomime is the attraction of going to a familiar theatre like His Majesty's in Aberdeen, the same theatre that your parents and grandparents went to see substantially the same sort of show, have the same experience. But beyond their value as statements, functionally, theatres are essentially conduits, aren't they, for the events and performances they present. And the fascinating thing about older buildings is the extent to which the content they offer and the contexts in which it's experienced has developed over the course of long lives to reflect new fashions and changes in underlying social attitudes and behaviours. By archival sources, I mean not only documents and records, material from museums and galleries and public and private collections, but printed sources, newspapers, journals and magazines, memoirs and diaries, and a wide range of material culture pertaining to theatre and public amusements, all the paraphernalia, theatre programmes, posters, press cuttings and reviews, scripts, production photos, postcards, oral history interviews, which I'm not actually going to have time for today, and recordings. These sources can add the missing elements that we need to produce a fuller picture of entertainment history, of the story, the human experience, the visual aspect, what something looked or felt like. Now, to illustrate these themes, I'm going to draw on some examples from my own research, which centres on 19th and early 20th century popular theatre and entertainments. So I will look at how a pantomime reflected Aberdeen's civic profile, what a music hall disturbance might say about contemporary attitudes towards entertainments, the influence of older, rough amusement culture centred on the fairground, the working lives of performers, and the changing place of Burns in popular entertainments, particularly in variety. So it's going to be a bit of a gallop. I should point out that these examples and case histories are very much work in progress and tentative. And because, like everyone else, I've been hampered by COVID restrictions, some of the scans are rather basic. But I'm going to start by examining what a 19th century Aberdeen pantomime tells us about local civic identity. As pantomime grew increasingly popular in Scotland in the second half of the 19th century, Scottish theatre managers encouraged a new development, the introduction of stories based on subjects from Scottish literature and history. A key author of these pieces was William Lowe, whose dates were sort of 1836, I think, to 1919, an actor and dramatist born in Aberdeen, who from the 1860s provided pantomimes for theatres in Glasgow and Edinburgh based on foundational myths of Scottish cities, with titles like Let Glasgow Flourish, 1868, and Edina White Heart of the Lothians, about Edinburgh, 1869, as well as pantomime versions of Tam O'Shanter and Alexander Wilson's Watty and Meg, which he wrote for Paisley. In 1878, Lowe wrote a pantomime, was commissioned to write a pantomime for Aberdeen, a version of Bluebeard, a popular subject, for Her Majesty's Theatre and Opera House, which is now the Tivoli. Written specifically for the Aberdeen theatre and audience, Lowe's script combined a flattering emphasis on the city's municipal achievements with a unionist scenario that not only linked its prosperity to Scottish involvement in imperial policies overseas, but did so by setting the action of the story in Afghanistan, at the time the scene of a colonial war in which British troops were currently engaged. The story of Bluebeard, the Demon of the Khyber Pass, the Sisters of Lahore, Harlequin Young Scotland, and the Good Fairy, to give it its full title, begins with an urgent call for a hero to save a princess from a fate worse than death at the hands of the murderous Bluebeard, who is coincidentally aiding Britain's enemies in their war in Afghanistan. On the recommendation of the Aberdonian fairy Thistledown, the mission is entrusted to a young student from the city who turns out to be none other than young Scotland, the Knight of Bon Accord. The dialogue of the scene gives a good example of the tone throughout. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back a few. There we go. Here we are. Young Scotland says, I take the mission, Queen, and crave it. Where danger is, a Scots the first to brave it. Fairy Queen, well said. I'll furnish you with all directions, with maps and charts, and notes to my connections. Continues a bit. Young Scotland says, my motto, bon accord and bravery. Here is your standard, knight, made by our queen. 'Tis blazoned with the arms of Aberdeen. To your courageous conduct I award it. Firm as my granite nature, I will guard it. When the action switches to Afghanistan, the story is populated almost exclusively by national stereotypes. Pat Malloy, a stage Irishman. Growlemoff, a comic Russian. Major McMinty, a Scottish soldier. And Hungarino, a porky Aberdonian servant who says things like help my Bob and yearns for Bobby Batson, Finn and Haddy. Now, the comic two-dimensionality is rendered more surreal by references to places and personalities from the real-life conflict. The rebellious potentate that Bluebeard is abetting, the Khan of Kenwa, is referred to at one point as Shere Ali, the real-life leader of the Afghan forces. And at another, characters are imprisoned in Fort Mujid, shortly to be the site of a major battle. But in other respects, the script's responses to the imperialist setup are more complex than might be supposed. The kilted figure of young Scotland is, as written, an embodiment of imperial selflessness, who leads Scottish troops into action, bayonets fixed, with couplets such as, then on, my friends, although the path be gory, we'll strike again for Britain and for glory. The prowess of Highland-Scottish soldiers is regularly extolled, and before the final push to victory, the company sing under the British flag. But young Scotland's military fervour is also sometimes sent up by other characters. At various points, he's called a jingo and a tartan toy, and the fact that, like Pat Malloy, the stage Irishman, he is played as a principal boy by a female actor who was commended in a press review for the enthusiasm of her Scotch dancing, suggests the role may well have received a burlesque performance, calculated to undercut its appearance on the page. So Lowe's pantomime extols Aberdeen's civic status as a unionist player in the wider imperial project. It's bang up to date in presenting a topical setting for its scenario, and it features a range of reductive national stereotypes, as were commonly featured in the discourse of Victorian music hall and burlesque. But although it was highly chauvinistic in its brand of militaristic patriotism in celebrating imperial achievements, very typical of the time, it also offered a Scotch comic figure who spoke in Doric and provided wry asides that represented a more critical populist take on social class. So close reading of the script reveals a more complex and nuanced take on social and political attitudes of the time than might first meet the eye. Now, I cut on past those earlier images, but the script itself was also a literary product, as we can see here from this, published as a booklet called A Book of Words. It was on sale so that audiences could read it in advance. And the first account, in fact, of Bluebeard in the Aberdeen Press and Journal was a review of this Book of Words before the actual production had opened. The advertisements include various high-end Emporia outfitters and retail businesses, which are interesting to see, along with details of the technical credits and performances. You'll see on the right the list of grand morning performances, usually starting at 2 p.m. Or 3 p.m, illustrates that the term afternoon was not yet in common usage. Morning continuing until early evening, the term afternoon only being used by tradesmen and shop people. So an interesting thing. This cartoon shows a morning performance with a mother trying to leave her baby with a box office money taker. And she says, here's its bottle in case it greets. Moving on, I'm going to now look at some press reports to examine a public disturbance at an Aberdeen music hall. Theatres like Her Majesty's, later the Tivoli, the Palace and HMT were prestigious venues, substantial city centre landmarks, which represented the upper end of the theatrical market. But they were only part of the story. Many lesser theatres and entertainment venues were short-term speculative undertakings that, due to commercial and market factors, were often only in existence for a short period. An example was the Bon Accord Music Hall, which operated in St Nicholas Lane for 3 years from 1888. The building no longer exists. In 1889, the hall was the scene of a disturbance, which offers insights into late 19th century society. and attitudes towards particularly youth and entertainment. Now, the disturbance occurred on Friday, the 5th of April, in the evening at a benefit performance for the hall's proprietor, Mr. Bromhead. Benefit performances in which the proceeds of the performance after costs went to the named recipient were a big part of the Victorian theatrical economy. And were essential for performers and managers. Detailed accounts appearing of what happened appeared in Aberdeen newspapers the next day. The P&J report, you can see here, was headed "Rowdyism in an Aberdeen Music Hall, Extraordinary Scene," while the Aberdeen Free Press was a bit blunter with "Riot in the Bon Accord Music Hall," terming the incident a disgraceful riot that might have been attended with very serious circumstance. In fact, the P&J admits it was effectively a riot as well. After setting the scene, that the hall had opened on August the 20th, and this was the last week of its season. It described how the benefit featured a program of unusual length, which, quote, drew a large crowd to the place, and when the curtain rose, the hall was filled, the cheaper seats being almost wholly occupied by boys and young men. So initially all went well until late on, after one or two performers had failed to appear, provoking some grumbling. Shortly before the end, it was announced that an advertised sketch, Tickle Me, would not after all be performed. This led to what the P&J termed, quote, booing, hooting and hissing. When Bromhead, the manager, attempted to placate the audience by singing a song in its place, the disturbance only increased, and the orchestra's attempt to strike up God Save the Queen as a way of ending the evening actually triggered the eruption from dissatisfied sections of the audience. As the curtain was half lowered, as the Free Press put it, a disgraceful riot took place. The lads and men in the body of the hall shouted and yelled as only a music hall audience can do, and then began to tear up the hinged seats that are made to cross the passages. In a short time, 16 of these were wrenched off and pitched onto the stage, to the great danger of the members of the orchestra, who, quote, initially stood their ground before retreating amid the derisive cheers and groans of the occupants of the area. In what the Free Press described as a scene of the wildest confusion, the orchestra and the stage itself were quickly taken possession of by youths who seemed to be completely filled with a spirit of demonic mischief. And they were loudly cheered by the audience in the galleries. Several gas brackets were wrenched from their fastenings and a number of footlights smashed. Eventually, 6 constables arrived and drawing their batons were able to clear the hall and disperse the crowd. Quote, but even when outside, the crowd were determined to wreak their vengeance on the building, and several windows were smashed before the police could clear the road. 3 men were arrested and marched to the city police office, followed by a large howling mob. The next morning, the 3 lads were brought before Aberdeen Police Court, charged with taking part in the disturbance. One case was dismissed, but the other 2, a 19-year-old labourer of Ship Row and a mill worker, aged 16, of Gallowgate, were convicted and fined 21 shillings or 10 days in prison. As the story circulated in the national press, the rowdyism of the P&J's headline gave way to "Riot in an Aberdeen Music Hall" in Glasgow and Dundee papers, and it was subsequently carried by papers in Liverpool, Birmingham, Derby and Leicester. Responses to the incident revealed a difference in emphasis. The Glasgow Evening Citizen typically condemned the disgraceful behaviour of sections of the audience, describing how uproar prevailed as missiles were thrown and damage caused, glass broken. But the Falkirk Herald had a different slant, reporting simply that, quote, Aberdeen audiences stand no nonsense, stating that the disturbance occurred owing to an item in the programme being omitted, inferring that the hall's management were at least partly to blame. Some Aberdeen opinions were also more relaxed. Bon Accord, a magazine that often brought a satirical lens to its coverage of city life and affairs, couldn't resist wryly contrasting the end of the Bon Accord Music Hall season with its brilliant inauguration, remarking that, quote, in the first instance, the magistrates appeared before the audience, while in the second, the order of things was slightly reversed, and certain of the audience appeared before the magistrates. It ended dramatically by stating that, quote, young Aberdeen is asserting itself in a new phase which bids fair to rival a Glasgow Irish audience or the denizens of Whitechapel. The tongue-in-cheek, rather flippant tone was reflected in a gleeful full-page cartoon of the riot, imagined as a Marx Brothers-style comic brawl in which the artist had incorporated details from the press reports, complete with ripped hats which the P&J had mentioned, and Music on Stands, titled Bon Accord Valse. But rhetoric aside, the magazine concluded that managements often bore part of the responsibility for such incidents through their policy of, quote, long and impossible programs being set as a bait to attract music hall frequenters, the cutting down of which inevitably caused friction. So what are we to make of this? Music hall riots or disturbances were a regular occurrence and made welcomely lurid copy. There was a very similar instance in Glasgow in the mid-1880s in which the manager similarly found himself off stage trying to placate the audience. But the more worldly, proportionate response of other commentators who regarded the hall's management as being partly responsible for over-promising in order to boost the box office of the night, rather gives the lie to the faux moral outrage affected by some others. So moving on, although music hall took place in brick and mortar auditoriums, the format and ambience was not like that encountered in playhouses, in theatres. As the Free Press remark about the Bon Accord crowd shouting and yelling, quote, as only a music hall audience can do, signalled. Music hall rather belonged to an older, more boisterous, rough entertainment culture, the world of circuses and street and fairground-based shows, rattlers and penny gaffs. Subsequent theatres were often built on the footprint of these older entertainments, which took place in wooden and canvas buildings and operated on a seasonal basis, often in conjunction with travelling shows. Portable theatres, known as rattlers, booth theatres which offered comedy, variety-style entertainments and melodrama, were a long-standing feature of city life, which exerted a formative influence on the tastes of many later playgoers. In 1905, a local journalist wrote wistfully of the disappearance of old stock companies and of the more visceral style of theatre he had grown up with. This starts bottom left, but I've got an enlargement. He stated, I yield to no man in my love of the legitimate drama, properly staged and mounted, but nevertheless, I confess to a weakness for low entertainments. Shows of the penny gaff or tippenny rattler order, spectacular triumphs of the kind associated with Sir Augustus Harris, and he means Drury Lane spectacles or sensation dramas. These I would exchange any night for the roar of the gods in a wooden booth with canvas roof, if in winter an open fire with a brazier near the stage, that same stage made of deals set shakily upon trestles, in other words just planks on trestles, a battered proscenium and a corps dramatique of 6 members in which each man in a night plays many parts. So the influence of this style of performance in shaping public taste was still strongly felt. Rattlers and booths were often fairly basic. One portable theatre advertised for sale in the 1860s involved a wooden pavilion, which was 88 feet by 48 feet, which was advertised as holding 2,000. However, other aspects of the show business were in fact sizable, more elaborate concerns that had an enduring relationship with their audiences based on long-standing ties. Printed materials from the archive, programs, posters and advertisements describe the content of performances, but also help evoke their distinctive aesthetic. The sophistication of these marketing devices, because that's what they were, can also challenge our preconceptions. For example, modern audiences consider circuses as transient or occasional, whereas advertisements and programs make clear that until well into the 20th century, circus was a regular, familiar and expected presence in urban contexts, a fixture really, staged in extended seasons lasting months and formed a long-standing part of city centre entertainments. And circuses were prominent in city centre sites that later often became locations for theatres, but the structures in which they performed were themselves often evidently far from primitive. In October 1866, Quaglieni's new Italian cirque, located in Bridge Street off Union Bridge, advertised itself as, quote, superior to any similar structure ever erected in Aberdeen. Designed by a local builder for the production of equestrian spectacles, majestic and noble horsemanship, and gorgeous cavalcades, its interior included a grand Parisian promenade with boxes so contrived as to partake of the comforts of the drawing room and carpeted throughout, while the building was brilliantly lit by gas. So not what the term circus necessarily conjures up. The leading circuses were important brands, while Quaglieni's was short-lived. it was sold a couple of years later. John Henry Cook's circus was a long-standing attraction in Aberdeen. In a 1900 interview, John Henry's father, Henry Cook, then 86, stated that it was 70 years since he had first come to Aberdeen, dating his first appearance there to 1830. Cook's shows included a wide range of entertainments adapted for its equestrian performances, from pantomimes such as Aladdin, or as here, Ride a Cock Horse to Banbury Cross, to spectacular versions of Tam O'Shanter and Dick Turpin's Ride to York, at sites including Market Street and Bridge Street, later the site of the palace. And they would also teach wealthy people to ride. You can see on this programme on the bottom right, there's the harlequinade, as in pantomimes everywhere at this time. And here's a picture of a harlequinade circus style with the various characters. Other famous circuses who appeared in Aberdeen in the 1890s included Sangers, Pindars, and Bostock and Wombwell's Menagerie and Circus, while Barnum and Bailey's also visited the city in 1899. And this is an illustration of John Henry Cook's circus grand inauguration, their opening of the season in 1896, showing all the civic dignitaries attending. So a part of the entertainment establishment. Fairground shows and amusements were also conduits for new styles and fashions and the latest novelties and technological innovations. For example, White's Carnival at the Reclaim Ground, was this the Inches, in May 1896, included a daring parachutist, the intrepid Miss Beaumont, who had, quote, nearly been dashed to the ground from the roof of a house in Clarence Street when making an ascent 2 Saturdays previously. The carnival also included variety show, fireworks, shooting, saloons galore, Punch and Judy shows, magnificent switchback gondolas costing over £3,000. The constant pressure to reflect the latest fashions was echoed in marketing materials, such as posters and programs, which, at their most striking, project the aesthetic of the entertainment concerned. And this was true across the case in commercial entertainments. So the rather restrained tone of Cook's circus programs of the 1880s, which were designed to mimic that of the rather sober tone of middle-class playhouses, give way to the exuberant colour playbills of the new Palace Variety Theatre from the early 1900s, seen on the left here, and the Collins organisation's striking late 30s Art Deco designs for the Tivoli on the right. In the inter and post-war periods, Variety's different phases are marked by a range of visually distinctive playbills and programmes. These are So moving on, another aspect of theatre that archival resources can help recover is the working lives of theatre performers, their lives and careers, but also the styles and content of their performances and what gave it appeal and resonance for audiences. Part of this involves examining what was actually performed in a given context, which is not always what we expect. For instance, Harry Lauder, seen here, is widely associated with his Scotch comic performance as a capering figure wearing a range of exaggerated tartan stage costumes that became his signature. Here he is as Aberdeen's favourite comedian. But Lauder appeared regularly in Aberdeen. And just to go back on that then, so the tartan signature may well be held to be true of his broader profile on the world stage. But Lauder appeared regularly in Aberdeen from the early 1890s, initially at the Alhambra Music Hall in Market Street. And his act, like many Scotch comics who came before him, was character-based, in that he delivered each song, usually with a complete change of costume, in a different persona. While some of these featured tartan, many others involved urban settings and characters. Music hall was an urban form which tended to centre on modern city or town life. And these songs concerned aspects of everyday life, of daily living, falling in love, being henpecked, the world of work, having too much to drink, having trouble getting up in the morning. These images of Lauder from one of his books give an idea of his wider gallery of characters. Returning to appear at the Palace in Aberdeen in 1905, now as a national star after his triumph in London 3 or 4 years earlier, Lauder was felt to be, quote, most successful in his old piece, the poignant The Softest of the Family, about a simple boy. Rather than being a crowd-pleasing or comic song, the reviewer wrote of the song's pathos that, quote, this is a genuine study of character. I've never seen or heard anything better of its kind. The audience did Mr. Lauder the honour of listening in perfect silence. so not what we might expect. Aberdeen and the North East produced a quota of stars, local and national. Jack Lorimer from Forres, but who stressed Aberdeenshire origins whenever in the city, was a Scotch comic who followed Lauder in playing in the United States, being awarded a ticker tape parade in New York. His famous son was Max Wall. James Scott Skinner, who I don't have an image of here, the Strathspey King from Banchory, came from an earlier age of what we would call now small-scale touring, and published his colourful memoirs in later life. Both promoted their celebrity and repertoire through sheet music and gramophone recordings. In contrast, Walford Bodhi, MD, the Scottish electric wizard, was a stage illusionist from Macduff, a flamboyant showman who projected his image and act entirely through advertising and publicity stunts. A striking figure. Capitalizing on his saturnine Svengali-like looks, Bodhi's act revolved around fascination with early electricity, which he combined with demonstrations of X-rays and what he termed bloodless surgery. So here he is, modestly the wonder of the world, the most remarkable man in the world, the modern miracle wonder worker for his healing powers. In 1903, he conducted this stunt in which he apparently put an Aberdonian into a trance for a week. He was appearing in the city at the time, and this was absolutely typical of Bodhi's sort of activity. This photograph from the Scottish Theatre Archive shows Bodhi's electric chair in which he electrocuted a member of the public. Bodhi presented his act in a touring review with a supporting variety bill. The production photo shows Bodhi's fun on an ocean liner. There are scenes from this in the bottom panel of the poster. And interestingly, as a man of science, I see he's not beyond a bit of ventriloquism sitting in the middle there. His company included his assistant, La Belle Electra, the human Leyden jar, who had all sorts of currents put through her in experiments, who was actually his sister-in-law, Isabella Henry, seen on the left here. And on the right is his wife, rather formidable, Jeannie, known as Princess Rubia. In 1909, at the height of his fame, Bodhi was prosecuted by the BMA for falsely claiming medical credentials. He was always called Dr. Walford Bodhi, but charmed the judge by explaining that this was never the case. He'd never claimed this, and the letters MD after his name stood for Merry Devil. He charmed the courtroom. He got off the charge, but the next week at the Coliseum in Glasgow, medical students staged a riot, stopping his act at the First House. The event is described by the playwright James Bridie, one of the students who took part in his memoirs. In 1916, Bodhi was returning from India when his ship was torpedoed, the story making the front page of the Daily Mirror. He lost all his stage props and costumes, reportedly worth £7,000. In his heyday, though, Bodhi was famous enough to have been impersonated by the teenage Charles Chaplin, who in his memoirs includes a photograph of himself doing Walford Bodhi. So he was a national figure, albeit briefly. The performances and repertoires of stars are, of course, relatively easy to trace and recover. They tend to be very well documented. But what of jobbing music hall performers? What were their careers like, and what did they perform? Postcards, produced to sell to fans and used as professional calling cards, sometimes constitute the only visual evidence of performers and their acts. Two examples I came across reference Aberdeen. Were they local performers? The first, with the mark of photographer's Laird of 246 Union Street, Aberdeen, in the bottom corner there, is of Fanny Wallace and Harry Dent. Although not from Aberdeen, this husband and wife act were local favourites and appeared regularly at the city's theatres in the sort of pre-First World War and First World War period. Their successful comedy act was titled The Indian Bottle, which they did all over the country, called a comedietta. I think an infinitely expanding sort of sketch that could take the introduction of lots of different songs and material. Does this perhaps show it? I think this could be part of the act. The card for another double act, Anderson and Nash, carries a permanent address, 30 Ship Row, Aberdeen. So were they from the city? Was it possible to develop a career as a music hall turn based in Aberdeen? That's Ship Row in 1900. There clearly were performers based in Aberdeen, as these adverts from 1905 show, from the Bon Accord. Dan Fraser was a well-known Scotch comic in the sort of Lauder mode. This pair, Nellie Anderson and Pat Nash, I managed to trace their careers through Aberdeen papers and the music hall press. And their career shows really the resourcefulness and entrepreneurial instincts of performers, of what you needed to do to sustain a living in a very precarious profession. The pair first appeared in Variety at the Tivoli in July 1912. By 1917, they were at one of the live turns, appearing at the new casino in Wales Street. Opened the previous year, the casino offered a new form, cine variety, with 3 live acts appearing interspersed between the films, which here included a Douglas Fairbanks picture on the poster. Interesting hearing the Lord Provost talk about how he remembered the casino as being run down, and this is a picture of it late in its life, towards the end. But it clearly was, judging from the poster, rather smart when it opened. A review confirmed the pair were local, describing them, Anderson and Nash, as 2 of Aberdeen's most successful comedy tit-bit eccentrics, who have got away from their numerous English engagements to pay a visit to their native city, where their engagement was highly appreciated. And the use of the term comedy tit-bit eccentrics, which is on the postcard, suggests that the postcard is contemporary to this. And there's a little snippet showing them getting billing at the casino. By the summer of 1917, they were working for a big circuit, the Stoll Circuit, and this is an enlargement showing them, again, sort of headline at Ardwick Empire, so they're doing very well. And by 1919, they were again at the Tivoli in a touring review, Great Scott, where for the first time we can get an idea of what they're like as performers. A previous preview, a review of the show, describes Pat Nash as the leading comic, quote, the small-sized comedian with the husky voice who succeeded in raising roar after roar of laughter, and was at his best in an eccentric dance in which he appeared to be about 2 feet high. Nellie Anderson was the star lady, and she sang Sailing on the Henry Ford with considerable success. The fast-paced production featured music, comedy, and actually plenty of titillation. There was also a large female chorus who featured in a Parisian studio scene, a bathing scene, and a harem. And in 1924, the pair returned to the Tivoli in another such variety review from London to New York, where they received billing in the local Aberdeen press. Now, this is the Tivoli, and on the left, this is another of these style of reviews. This isn't Anderson and Nash. This is a late 20s review. But this style of touring comedy review, which had all sorts of separate acts and sketches and shaners, was very much the form that variety theatre took in the 1920s. And the Tivoli, of course, at this time hadn't been open that long as a variety theatre. And this is London to New York, with Pat Nash and Nellie Anderson being given billing in the Aberdeen press. In 1913, an advert in the Era neatly encapsulates their professional skills. They are vocalists, comedy acrobats and dancers, and they're doing pretty well. So this is the top advertisement here. There are no vacancies for the next 6 months. This week they're at the Empire Dublin, and next week returning to the Palace Theatre Aberdeen. It confirms that their permanent address is Ship Row, but makes clear that Nellie also has a second string to her bow. She runs a dance troupe, Nellie Anderson's $6, playing at the Palace South London. And in the ad below that, the same year, Nellie Anderson has several dance groups, including the 8 Violets. And this is something that's sustained over the next few years. Nellie also performs her own single act. A 1913 item advertises 2 Scotch songs she's singing and promoting. Nellie Anderson of Anderson and Nash. The pair have a long performing career. You can follow them all the way through the 30s and early 40s. In 1943, they returned to the Tivoli, now billed as Pat Nash and Helen. After a long career, Pat Nash died in 1951, and in 1960, a report of his wife's death appeared in the stage. Quote, Helen Nash, widow of Pat Nash, of the act Nellie Anderson and Pat Nash, and later as Helen and Pat Nash, August Peanuts, of 16 Broad Street, Brighton, died on December the 5th. In his last years, Pat had worked as a circus clown for Bertram Mills at Olympia. The reference to Pat as August Peanuts, a persona, refers to his circus name as an August, the term for the clumsy, baggy-suited figure who acted as foil to the clown proper, the elegant figure in sparkling white costume and white makeup with a cone hat. The clues were there in the reviews of Pat's performances. With his adeptness at eccentric dancing and skills as an acrobat, Pat came from the broad, slapstick, clowning end of the variety spectrum. And if we look back at these little pictures taken from the original postcard, we can see, with his baggy suited costumes, that Pat's august style was always present in his music hall act. Helen and Pat were not stars, but were representative of jobbing performers. Their career, begun in Aberdeen before World War I and ended in semi-retirement in Brighton in the 1950s, took in regular visits to Aberdeen theatres such as the Casino, Palace and Tivoli, and performing in everything from cine variety, music hall, variety theatre, revues and pantomime, to managing and choreographing dance troupes and circus clowning. The theme of continuous evolution of entertainment forms constantly developing and eliding as fashions change is also applicable to the last area I plan to briefly examine, the changes in the ways that Burns is celebrated in popular entertainments. Burns's popularity grew enormously in the late 19th century, boosted by the Burns anniversary celebrations of 1859 and by popular entertainers such as James Houston and W.F. Frame, who used Burns material, sketches and characters in their acts. Burns' characters and stories became a common feature of magic lantern and diorama presentations. The combining of live concerts with songs and recitations with visual technology was again evident in this 1904 Burns concert, in which the performers, famous names, the tenor J.M. Hamilton, the actor John Clyde, were augmented by Walker and Company's cinematograph with new pictures of the land of Burns. By the early 20th century, while Scottish variety theatre had come to venerate the figure of Burns as a national icon, the performance of his songs and poems took second place to this symbolic importance. In the 1960s and 70s, Burns regularly featured in variety sketches, imagining what the poet would have made of contemporary Scotland and the permissive society. This idea of Burns brought back to life and bemused by the changes he encounters inspired a 1977 Jimmy Logan sketch written for his variety season at His Majesty's Theatre. In the script, now in the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland archives, Burns, to the strains of Rantin' Rovin' Robin, walks back into Nancy Poosey's From the Gents and tells his disbelieving drinking companions that centuries have passed. Man, I've been out in the stars among 200 years. His friend says, you're glaikit, Rab, or else you're foo. A minute's fine or maybe two. You trotted out to find the loo, quick as a fox. And I found myself with a Doctor Who in a wee police box. Rab's stream of wry observations on contemporary society and its social and sexual mores, which now say more about the social conservatism of Scotland in the 1970s than Burns's legacy, include that, quote, they have this thing called the welfare state that pays you over and over again, a bonus for your every wane. When Nancy suggests Rab would have the system bankrupted a year with his prodigious appetites, he explains, quote, to make sure I could do nae ill, they bought out something called the pill. And do they give it to you free? Aye, at the university. So to conclude, materials from the archive can help demonstrate the much wider and richer range of entertainments available to urban audiences in Scottish cities between the late 19th century and First World War than is sometimes appreciated. It also illustrates how these entertainments, often overlooked because they belong to an older amusement culture based on fairs and showgrounds, which linked back to pre-industrial forms, in fact overlapped with the introduction of early 20th century genres like cinema in ways that perpetuated a live performance culture until well into the interwar years. I'd like to finish by playing a brief extract from a recording. Much of this talk has been about trying to go beyond the footprint of theatre buildings to discern the appeal of the performances they presented. What was it that audiences liked? What kept them coming back? One of the best ways of discerning this is through recordings, and one performer who was quintessentially identified with Aberdeen was Harry Gordon, who ran his own company of entertainers at the Beach Pavilion, really in the interwar years, from the post-First World War to the outbreak of the Second. The Beach Pavilion another semi-permanent wooden structure, upgraded in 1928 to reflect an expanding new commercial entertainment business, reached its heyday under Gordon's management, a period again characterized by cheery, highly distinctive Art Deco designs. A warm and highly engaging comedian, Harry Gordon developed a whole gallery of characters based on the fictional town of Inversnecky and made a huge number of records. The joy of these recordings is that by including comic patter and crosstalk, the absolute heart of music hall comedy sketches, they convey a real sense of the act in progress. This record, a golfing sketch, features Gordon with his longtime feed, Jack Holden. I think it takes you back to the Beach Pavilion. So thank you for listening, and here to finish is a short extract, just a taster of Golf, Part 1 from 1930.
I'm a wee Scotch laddie, I'm what they call a caddie, I'm the lad that finds the ball before they're lost. If you find you can't play the game of golf the proper way, you can buy them back again at half the cost. Caddy, 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 how dare you sing in the middle of my car? Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Tell me, boy, is this the bus fee here? Yes, sir, yes, sir. You know, that's unfortunate. I've just knocked my ball into the graveyard. Into the cemetery? Yes. Oh, that's the last hole. Quite so it is. Well, I'll tell you what. Make me a fresh tea caddy. Tea caddy? What I said. Here, I'm near Smith. No, no, I'm a plumber by birth from my sister's side. Yes, yes, but I want you to make me a tea with some sand. Oh, you wouldn't like cocoa with bass break? No, no, I don't want a drink. No, I can smell that. Don't you understand? I want you to make me one of those sort of little, you know what I think. Oh, you mean a wee tootie? I beg your pardon? A wee tootie. Tootie? Would you mind saying that in English for me? A diminutive towrie. No, I'm just as far forward. Look here, give me a definition. Oh, yeah, and I got one. Try a nibbling. Kerry, you know, I think you're a colossal ignoramus. Ah, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. I'm a Presbyterian. It's silly art, sir.
Thanks very much. I'll finish there.